WVEC-TV, Hampton.
Time for Buttons Lane for two, and here we go.
This is Jim Kincaid, ABC News.
For this episode of the 13 News Now Vault, we're going way back to the oldest program we have in our archives. 1960 marked the 350th anniversary of the founding of the City of Hampton. And as part of the city's celebration, 13 News presented the History of Hampton. This special takes us back to 1607, where Captain John Smith feasted with the Native Americans at Strawberry Banks. English North America began to take shape. The history of names and places you recognize today is mentioned: Fort Monroe, Buckrow, Blackbeard, Kicquetan, Mallory, Magruder, Phoebus, Booker T. Washington, and Hampton Institute. But for all of the history this program presents, it is worth noting what it also does not discuss. You'll hear about Point Comfort, but there is no mention of the first enslaved Africans who landed there in 1619. Nor little is said of history and contributions of the Native Americans, who once called the Tidewater region home. The fight for civil rights and the mass resistance that pushed back against it are also subjects left untouched. The History of Hampton is a fascinating time capsule that we hope you enjoy watching, but it's one we hope you also watch with a critical eye to understand that the story of Hampton, and really all of America, is one often told through a narrow lens. We hope is one that we can continue to broaden going forward.
The year 1960 marked the 350th anniversary of the settlement of the City of Hampton. Hampton is today the oldest continuous English-speaking settlement in America. The Project 60 unit of WVEC-TV presents the History of Hampton.
How do you do, my friends, and welcome from this old waterman. I've worked around the waterfront of Hampton for all of the city's 350 years, and I was here before the white man came to settle. I saw the red man who inhabited these shores for centuries, and I watched the Spanish galleons which came into the harbor before 1600. Late in April of 1607, these eyes beheld the coming of 3 ships which brought Englishmen who would settle, who would stay, soldiers, seafarers, adventurers like Captain John Smith. They visited and feasted with the Indians at Strawberry Bank, then sailed westward into the mouth of the James River and proceeded up that river to Jamestown, and there they settled. But when the pickings grew lean at Jamestown and the colonists were in danger of starvation, Smith came down to the Indians at Kicquetan and carried back a supply of food. Christmas of 1608 saw Smith, Francis West, and George Percy celebrating with the same Indians, where, as they stated, we were never more merry nor fed on more plenty. Recognizing its key position at the entrance of the harbor, Captain Percy ordered a fort built at Point Comfort in 1609 and named it Fort Algernon in honor of his ancestor and the predecessor of the present Fort Monroe. In July of 1610, attempting to avenge the slaying of a colonist, a band of settlers captured and destroyed the Indian village at Kicquetan. 2 forts, named Henry and Charles, were built on the sides of the mouth of our Hampton River, each being garrisoned with 15 men. In the same year, the first parish church was established, and like the settlement, has remained in continuous existence to this day. This original prayer book is still at St. John's Church. The year 1619 saw the first great change in the government of Virginia. Hitherto there had been military rule. Now there was to be a legislative assembly, the first on these shores. And when it convened July 30th at Jamestown, William Tucker and William Capps represented Kicquetan. The colony was divided into 4 administrative units, ours being known as the Elizabeth City Corporation, named in honor of the daughter of King James. The following year, Frenchmen came to the colony and settled in the area known as Buck Row. In 1624, the second church was built on the east bank of Hampton River, replacing the earlier church. It was this church which acquired the communion silver still in the possession of the present St. John's Church. Silver which bears the hallmark 1618, 1619, and was used originally by an early up-country church. Education in America had its beginning here. The first bequest in behalf of education came in the will of Benjamin Sims in 1634, followed by a similar legacy from Thomas Eaton. Returns from the generosity of these two early settlers still helped to finance Hampton's schools each year. In 1667, the site of the church was moved again to a location on what is now Pembroke Avenue. Black marble stones still retain their positions over many of the early graves. In June of 1680, the Assembly passed a law creating a town in each county for the encouragement of trade and manufacture. The town in Elizabeth City County was laid out on the west bank of the Hampton River. It soon became the headquarters for the Customs District and for the river pilots, and by 1698 numbered 184 men in its militia. Pre-shipping that centered around Hampton early in the 18th century, the waters were visited frequently by pirates and privateers. And in 1718, Governor Alexander Spotswood sent Lieutenant Henry Maynard with a fleet from Hampton to put an end to it. Maynard attacked the notorious Blackbeard, captured the pirates' band, and brought back the leader's head on a pike. It was displayed at the entrance of Hampton River as a grisly warning. The church having fallen into a state of disrepair, the Governor's Council decided in October of 1727 that the new church should be built in Hampton Town as the most convenient place in the said parish. And so the church was built on Queen Street, where it stands to this day, having been 3 times destroyed and 3 times rebuilt. A brick fort was built on the site of old Fort Algernon in 1742. It mounted 22 guns and was called Fort George. It stood until 1749, when it was destroyed by a hurricane, and the gallant action of Captain Samuel Barron, the fort's commander, saved the lives of its garrison. George Wythe was born in Hampton at Chesterville in 1726. 20 years later, he returned to begin a career that led him to the nation's foremost position in the practice and teaching of law. The colonies were swept into war with the French and Indians in the middle of the century, and in February of 1755, General Edward Braddock landed in Hampton to lead the first British troops brought to the colonies. And in 1775, war came, not with the French, but with the British, a revolution for self-rule. While George Wythe of Hampton sat with the Continental Congress, which drafted the Declaration of Independence, citizens of Hampton burned a looting English boat and successfully drove off ships that tried to attack the town in revenge. The most serious damage was to the church, which was the victim of a fire. Ships were built in Hampton under the supervision of Virginia's Naval Commissioner, Colonel Thomas Whiting of Hampton. The command of the Navy went to another Hamptonian, Captain James Barron, son of the commander of Fort George. As the war drew to its close at Yorktown, Hampton militia engaged a British raiding party trying to rejoin the forces of their traitor, General Benedict Arnold. Their commander, Colonel Francis Mallory, was high on the list of men wanted by the British. But he refused to run in the face of a force 5 times that of his own and fell mortally wounded with his troops after charging headlong into the invaders. Local militiamen took part in the siege of the British at Yorktown that ended the war. And the French allies used the courthouse at Hampton as a hospital for their wounded. With independence won, Hampton, like the rest of Virginia, took up the job of the formation of a new commonwealth and nation. 2 of the natives, George Wythe and Dr. James McClurg, headed the departments of law and medicine at the College of William and Mary, and were among Virginia's 7 delegates who went to Philadelphia to draw a federal constitution. The beginning of the 1800s saw Hampton continue foremost in naval and maritime affairs. The Federal Navy had but a mere handful of captains. 2 of them, Samuel and James Barron of Hampton, were sons of the commander of Virginia's Navy of the Revolution. And when President Jefferson ordered a fleet of gunboats built to protect our shores and commerce, the second contract went to a Hampton shipbuilder. Old Point Comfort saw its first lighthouse in 1802, one of the oldest structures still standing on the peninsula. It has guided mariners from that day to this. This time saw a rising interest in education, and in 1805 the Sims-Eaton lands were sold and the funds used to establish Hampton Academy, the area's first secondary school. The site was the familiar Sims-Eaton Academy, still in use today. The Revolution had spared Hampton substantial damage, but the War of 1812 did not. In June of 1813, a marauding naval force under Admiral Cockburn scattered the local militia and occupied the town. Taking over a substantial residence as headquarters, they plundered, thieved, and ravaged, and quartered their troops in St. John's Church. The church had suffered more from decay than from British abuse, and a public solicitation for funds, led by Captain James Barron's daughter, paved the way for its reconstruction. It was in this period that the Army began to replace the Navy as a primary interest of the region. In 1819, construction began on modern fortifications at Old Point Comfort. General Simon Bernard designed the fort, named in honor of President James Monroe. And a modern hotel known as the Hygeia was built just outside the fortifications, the first of a succession of resort accommodations at this location. The Hygeia was eventually replaced by the Chamberlain. Among the early troops garrisoned at Fort Monroe was Sergeant Major Edgar A. Perry, in reality, Edgar Allan Poe, who would later become Virginia's great man of letters. And to the post, to supervise the latter stages of construction, came another Virginian, Lieutenant of Engineers Robert E. Lee, 2 years out of West Point. Lee built 2 fortifications, those on the island now known as Fort Wool, and the water battery on the mainland. President Andrew Jackson started the trend toward a summer White House with a cottage on Fort Wool, where he relaxed in 1833, with his meals being served by special boat from the Hygeia Hotel. The tourists arrived in droves that summer to see Black Hawk, great chief of the Sac and Fox nations, who had been captured by the Army and imprisoned at Fort Monroe. Many came on the newly established steamship lines to the wharf at the point. Poe returned in 1849 and read his verses to admirers on the portico of the Hygeia, perhaps the last pleasant memory of his life, as he died less than a month later. In 1852, Hampton Academy was taken into the public school system, and John B. Carey, for 7 years its principal, built a school building next door and called it the Hampton Military Academy. It drew students from all over the South. In 1859, its graduates were addressed by former President John Tyler, whose summer residence, Villa Margaret, was in Hampton. Education was booming during the period. In 1854, the Chesapeake Female College was built on the site of the old Indian village of Kicquetan. It was a Baptist school headed by the Reverend Martin Forey. But the years of peace were short-lived. Secession threatened Virginia, and the feelings of Hampton were shown in the election of its delegate to the convention, which would decide the fate of the state. Colonel Charles K. Mallory, who was outspokenly opposed to secession. But Virginia seceded, and Mallory and Hampton went with her. And Mallory's slaves fled to Fort Monroe, where General Ben Butler refused to return them to their owner, declaring them contraband of war. His action was approved by federal authorities and widely copied. Her initial opposition to the principle of secession was overshadowed by Hampton's devotion to the Confederacy. Of a total of 4,200 white residents, including women and children, she sent more than 300 men to the gray-clad forces. Armed with new Colt pistols purchased by the citizens, Jeff Phillips led to war a dashing cavalry unit known as the Old Dominion Dragoons. It would fight with Jeb Stuart throughout most of the war. 2 infantry companies were mobilized, the Wythe Rifles under Captain William R. Willis and the Hampton Grays under Captain Benjamin F. Hudgens. They marched away with newly acquired Yankee muskets on their shoulders. And Captain Lawrence Smith went to war at the head of the red-capped Washington Artillery, the proud caretakers of Sergeant Bill Dougherty's brass cannon. The 5th Local Volunteer Company was another cavalry outfit, the York Rangers, commanded by Captain Jeff Sinclair. The majority of Hampton's civilian population moved away as the Yankee Army marched past the house of President Tyler, across the bridge, and into the town. Federal forces from Fort Monroe and Newport News attempted to march up the peninsula and ran into the Confederates at Big Bethel. The 4,400 Federals lost 76 men before they retired from the field. Among them, their artillery commander, Lieutenant John T. Greble. The Confederates lost 11, including Henry Lawson Wyatt of the 1st North Carolina Regiment, the first gray-clad soldier killed in the war. The South had won its first land victory. It was June 10th, 1861. General John B. Magruder commanded the Southern forces on the peninsula, and word reached him that Butler planned to quarter troops in Hampton through the winter. So he met in a farmhouse outside of town with his staff to outline plans. Hampton would be burned. The torch would be applied by its homeowners, now wearing Confederate gray. And on August the 7th, 4 squads crept into town under cover of darkness, warned the remaining inhabitants, and fired the town. A brilliant orange fireball leaped into the midnight sky and alarmed the Federal garrison a few miles away. But the mission had been accomplished. The following morning, Hampton was a mass of smoldering rubble and a wilderness of tottering walls and chimneys. 5 houses had escaped. The church had been destroyed again. For the first and only time in American history, men had reduced their homes to ashes rather than aid and comfort their enemies. But loyal Unionists began to rebuild Hampton, and the fall of the year saw Joseph Seeger, who had represented the area in the legislature, sent to Washington to represent a recaptured district in a seceded state. Seeger's farm was occupied by overflow forces from Fort Monroe, who named it Camp Hamilton. It stood on the present site of Phoebus. The Chesapeake Female College was taken over, renamed the Chesapeake Military Hospital, and was used for the convalescence of wounded Union troops. Throughout the war, the majority of the wounded were brought from all over eastern Virginia to the Hampton Military Hospital, which reached to the east bank of Hampton River. Between the two hospitals, the dead were buried in what would grow into a national cemetery. Confederates who died in captivity were buried alongside the Union dead. General George B. McClellan landed his Army of the Potomac at Fort Monroe early in 1862 and began his march up the peninsula in a futile attempt to take Richmond. Abraham Lincoln rode horseback through the streets of Hampton to see firsthand the hell of total war and stare silently at the walls that were all that remained of the church. A Confederate ship, rebuilt from the hull of the Union frigate Merrimac, was clad with iron and renamed the Virginia. She sailed from Norfolk to burn and sink Union ships off Hampton's shore, while Yankee cannonballs bounced harmlessly off her sloping sides. The following day, she met a Union ironclad, the Monitor, and these waters boiled in the forerunner of modern naval warfare. These giants of the sea battled for hours, and each withdrew. And don't let anyone tell you that either side won. They both can prove their point if they have to. And then the war passed Hampton by. And when it was over, they brought the president of the defeated Confederacy to Fort Monroe and imprisoned him and kept him there for 2 years. And Hampton began to rebuild crude shacks against existing chimneys at first. But as her former residents returned, she began to grow into a town once more. A Yankee general named Samuel Chapman Armstrong arranged for funds to buy the Little Scotland plantation and the site of Hampton Military Hospital to build a school for Negroes, Hampton Institute. And a young Negro lad named Booker T. Washington came to study. The old Chesapeake College site, acquired somehow by General Butler, was sold to the government to be used as a veterans hospital. We watermen began to take our catches into Hampton Harbor again and sell them to a rapidly growing seafood industry. And Hampton continued to grow and grow until by 1878, she was a pretty sizable town. There was a goodly collection of farms on the outskirts, but downtown Hampton began to take shape. And then in 1884, there was a devastating fire downtown. But for a change, the church didn't burn. But Hampton's fires throughout her history have destroyed all of her original landmarks. This fire taught Hamptonians a lesson, however, and they organized a volunteer fire department and got a hand-operated pumper to use in fighting future fires. But even fires can't impede progress, and by 1887 we had grown so big that we up and incorporated ourselves into a town. We were making progress with a capital P, and we progressed right on into the 20th century, becoming a city of the second class March the 30th, 1908. And then we began to go government in a big way. While the First World War was in progress, 3 of our citizens, Harry Holt, Hunter Booker, and Nelson Groom, heard that the government was looking for a place for an airfield. So they talked them into coming to Hampton. What had been the old plantations of Sherwood, Chesterville, Bloomfield, Lamington, and Cloverdale became Langley Field, and the flying service moved in with its airplanes. And something else sprang up at Langley Field, too. Wind tunnels. One, then more. Built and run by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and Hampton began to have residents who talked physics and higher mathematics. and didn't say out and about. The war came to an end, and aviation was here to stay. And Billy Mitchell came to Langley with a squadron of bombers to prove that he could actually sink a battleship. Everybody knew he couldn't do it, but they gave him some captured German ships to try it on. And he did. It was sad when the Ostfriesland went down. Sad for some folks, maybe, but good for aviation. Langley got new types of aircraft and started to grow into a sizable air base. The country's first lighter-than-air ship, the Roma, was stationed here. But she ran into high-tension wires and burned at Norfolk. And Hampton began to take on the look of a growing metropolis, with an automobile for almost every garage. And even during the Depression, there were no bread lines in Hampton. Up and down Queen Street, people started to remodel their storefronts and wished that there was some way to widen the street. You could park on both sides of the street in those days, but it was a tight squeeze some places when the streetcar passed. By the end of the 30s, when it looked like we were heading toward another war, the NACA and other government facilities began expanding with more buildings and more people. And shopping centers began springing up. And the war came and went. And the people who moved here launched the greatest period of growth in our history. One day, everybody in Hampton and Phoebus and all Elizabeth City County got together and said, "We'll be one big city and see how well we can make out." And in 1952, we did it. And Hampton became what is known as a first-class city. But the growing didn't stop there. True, we have farms in our city and superhighways mile after mile. And it looks like we're never going to get done paving and repaving streets. But we have new industries. We manufacture brassware and electronic instruments. We shuck oysters and we pick crabs and we still gather them and bring them in. And our people build ships for modern men of the sea. And we work for the government. And we've grown. Ours is a heritage that stretches back 350 years. Rich on the ideals that reach beyond that. Rich on the transplantings that have strengthened our native soil. And proud of the efforts of those who offered their lives before our memory began. And those we remember only as old men with beards and suits of gray. And those who trooped to Cuba. And those who shipped to France. And those who fought in Africa and Italy and Germany and up and down the islands. And those who learned that red is not only a color in our flag. And those who stand ready tonight, they are the history of Hampton. They and you and I. But our history is told not only in our past and our present, but in our future as well. For when the final booster places the capsule in orbit, we'll think of that man in space and smile to ourselves and say to the rest of the world, we've been more than 350 years doing it, but we finally put one of our boys up there. And he, too, is in the history of Hampton.